The surgeon stood in the freezing wind of an English airfield, staring at the line of B-17 bombers returning from Germany. They limped in one by one, engines coughing smoke, wings torn by flak. Ambulances waited by the runway, their red crosses stark against the mud. Each time a bomber touched down, medics ran forward to pull out the wounded. Every day was the same. The same broken men. The same shattered bodies. And the same question burned in his mind: why were they dying the same way, over and over again? His name was Dr. Dwight H. Johnson, a U.S. Army Air Forces surgeon stationed with the 8th Air Force in 1943. He was no soldier in the traditional sense, no gun, no helmet, but he was fighting his own war, one waged not against the enemy, but against bureaucracy. Every day he saw the price of air combat. Bombardiers slumped over their sights, pilots bleeding out at the controls, waist gunners shredded by fragments of flak. They were the faces of the air war, and for Johnson, they were more than statistics. They were young men whose bodies told the same tragic story. Most of them didn't die from direct hits. They died from metal shards, jagged pieces of steel that tore through the thin skin of their aircraft and into flesh. At first, Johnson did what any good doctor would do: he treated, he documented, he analyzed. He kept meticulous notes on wounds, entry points, trajectories, causes. But after hundreds of cases, a pattern emerged. Nearly 70% of fatal injuries among bomber crews came from flying fragments, not bullets. A shell would explode nearby, sending hundreds of steel splinters slicing through the fuselage, hitting torsos, abdomens, and lungs. Helmets offered some protection for the head, but the rest of the body was completely exposed. The men who survived often joked that their leather jackets were about as useful as tissue paper. Johnson didn't laugh. He started sketching designs in his notebook. He imagined a vest, something light enough to wear for hours at altitude, but strong enough to stop shrapnel. The British had been experimenting with flak suits, but they were bulky, made from layers of canvas and manganese steel plates. Too heavy for aircrew, too cumbersome in the cramped interior of a bomber. Johnson believed he could do better. But he faced a problem: no one wanted him to try. To the Air Force brass, Johnson's obsession was a distraction. His orders were to treat the wounded, not redesign their uniforms. The Army's Medical Corps had already evaluated protective gear and decided it wasn't practical. Weight was the enemy. Every extra pound on a bomber meant less fuel, less altitude, less chance of making it home. Headquarters had closed the book on the issue. But Johnson refused to close his. Late at night, in the quiet of the base hospital, he began working on his idea in secret. He scrounged materials: scrap aluminum, thin steel sheets, parachute webbing. He enlisted help from ground mechanics, men who knew how to work metal. Using the tools of an aircraft shop, they hammered and shaped thin steel plates into curved segments, then stitched them into canvas pockets that could be worn over the chest and abdomen. It wasn't elegant, but it was something. Johnson tested the prototype himself, standing in front of sandbags while an armorer fired fragments and .45 caliber rounds at the vest. The bullets didn't go through. The fragments barely dented it. It worked. But making it work on the battlefield was another story. To distribute the vests, Johnson needed approval, and authorization was not coming. When he submitted his reports to command, they were met with silence. When he pressed further, he was told to focus on his medical duties. Protective equipment, he was informed, fell under equipment logistics, not medicine. The implication was clear: stay in your lane. So he didn't ask again. Instead, Johnson did something that could have ended his career. He began producing the vests unofficially. Using spare metal from wrecked bombers and help from sympathetic mechanics, he built dozens of them by hand. When new crews arrived at the base, he quietly issued them out. The men called them Johnson's armor, and word spread quickly through the squadrons. Crews who wore them came back with fewer casualties. Waist gunners reported being hit by flak and walking away with bruises instead of holes. Pilots swore they could feel the fragments pinging off their chests. Soon, demand outpaced supply. Johnson's unauthorized workshop became a rumor throughout the airfields of East Anglia. Mechanics traded parts for steel plates. Crews passing through his base begged for vests before heading into combat. Still, officially, the project didn't exist. His commanding officers knew, they just didn't want to know. As long as the results kept coming in, nobody wanted to stop the surgeon who was saving lives. Then, one morning in early 1944, a general showed up. A bomber group had just returned from a raid on Bremen, and for the first time, every man in one of Johnson's protected aircraft had come home alive. The difference was undeniable. Word had reached high command. The general inspected one of the vests, felt its weight, and looked Johnson in the eye. "Where did you get this approved?" he asked. Johnson's answer was simple. "I didn't." The confrontation could have ended his career. The general's tone was not angry, but his question hung in the air like a threat. Johnson knew what it meant to admit he'd gone around the chain of command. For a moment, the weight of his decision pressed hard: months of secret work, unauthorized use of resources, the quiet complicity of mechanics and medics. But instead of defending himself, Johnson pointed to the line of ambulances beyond the hangar, to the men being carried out of the bombers. "Sir," he said, "I'd rather be court-martialed for saving them than commended for letting them die." The general didn't respond immediately. He turned the vest over in his hands, testing its weight, tracing a finger over the dented steel plates. Then, without another word, he handed it back. "Keep making them," he said quietly, and walked away. That single exchange changed everything. For months, Johnson's operation had existed in the shadows, tolerated but never acknowledged. Now it had the attention of command, and that meant scrutiny. Word spread quickly through the upper echelons of the 8th Air Force Medical Division. Some officers praised his initiative, others condemned it as insubordination. The Air Corps Engineering Division demanded reports and testing data. The Surgeon General's office back in Washington sent a terse message requesting clarification on unauthorized field modifications to crew protection gear. But while the bureaucracy debated, Johnson's vests kept saving lives. The results were impossible to ignore. Crews equipped with his flak vests showed a dramatic drop in abdominal and chest wounds. Medics noticed that men who would have died from internal bleeding or punctured lungs were now walking into the hospital on their own. The difference was so consistent that statisticians began to take notice. In early 1944, after reviewing injury records across multiple bomber groups, analysts found that crews using Johnson's vests had casualty rates nearly 60% lower than those without. For the first time, there was hard proof that a simple innovation, a few pounds of steel, could change the odds of survival in one of the deadliest theaters of war. But official recognition was slow. To Washington, Johnson's project was still unofficial, an unsanctioned experiment born of defiance. Engineers worried about standardization, supply, and production. Could the vests be made safely in factories? Would they interfere with oxygen lines or restrict movement during bailout? Every question became an excuse for delay. Johnson grew restless. Men were still dying, and the paperwork seemed endless. So he kept doing what he'd always done: he worked around it. He expanded his operation, setting up a makeshift assembly line inside a maintenance hangar. Local British civilians helped stitch canvas pockets while mechanics shaped the steel. Each vest took hours to build, but within weeks, they were turning out hundreds. Johnson wasn't alone anymore. Other medical officers at nearby bases began copying his design. The Johnson vest, as it was now informally known, spread like wildfire across the 8th Air Force. The crews themselves became its most passionate advocates. They wrote letters home describing how the vests had saved them. Gunners bragged about the fragments that bounced off their chests, showing off the dents like medals. Pilots insisted their crews wouldn't fly without them. It became a superstition, a talisman of survival. If you don't wear one gunner wrote, you're just volunteering for a hole in the gut. The sentiment made its way up the chain, and soon even commanders who had once dismissed the idea began quietly requesting shipments. Then came the test that would silence every skeptic. On a mission over Schweinfurt, a formation of B-17s took heavy flak. Dozens of bombers were hit. One in particular, Lucky Lady, from the 379th Bomb Group, returned riddled with holes. The tail gunner had been struck directly by an explosion that peppered the fuselage with steel fragments. When medics reached him, they found his vest shredded, the canvas torn, the plates dented and blackened. Beneath it, his torso was covered in bruises, but not a single wound had penetrated. Johnson was there when they brought him in. The gunner's first words were half joking, half awed, "Doc, your damn vest works better than armor plate." Within days, the story made its way through headquarters. The Schweinfurt mission had been one of the worst of the war, but the survival of the Lucky Lady gunner became a symbol. Photos of his vest circulated through the ranks, along with reports of dozens of similar cases. The weight of evidence finally became too great to ignore. The Surgeon General's office formally requested a sample for testing in the United States. Johnson's design was shipped to Wright Field in Ohio, where ballistic engineers subjected it to controlled flak explosions and small arms fire. The results matched the field data. The vest could stop shrapnel at half the weight of existing British models. It was a vindication, and a turning point. The Air Force authorized mass production under the official designation M1 flak vest, based directly on Johnson's prototype. Factories in the U.S. began producing thousands, each one marked Aircrew Protective Assembly. By late 1944, bomber groups from England to Italy were being issued standardized versions of Johnson's invention. For the first time, airmen went to war with more than luck to protect them. But Johnson himself remained uneasy. To him, the fight had never been about recognition, it was about responsibility. "These boys trust us," he told one reporter months later. "If we can give them even a few ounces of protection, then that's our duty. I just did what any man with a conscience would do." In a strange twist, the man who defied the system became part of it. He was promoted, awarded a citation for initiative in combat medicine, and placed on a board to further develop aircrew protective gear. But even as he accepted the commendation, he knew the truth. The real victory wasn't his, it was in the hundreds of men walking off bombers alive because of something he wasn't supposed to build. The winter skies over Germany were black with smoke. From 30,000 feet, the clouds looked peaceful, but inside the bombers, the air was chaos. Flak bursts hammered the formations, the explosions blooming like dark flowers in the sky. Crews braced for impact, gripping their guns, their breath fogging the frosted glass. Metal screamed as fragments tore through fuselages, shattering gauges, punching through aluminum skin. In those seconds between the flash and the shock, every man aboard knew how thin the line between life and death had become. And yet, amid the thunder and shrapnel, something remarkable began to happen: men started to survive. By late 1944, the vest that Dr. Dwight Johnson had designed in secret was now flying over Europe in every major bomber group of the 8th and 15th Air Forces. It had gone from rumor to regulation, from field improvisation to factory standard. Crews called it the Guardian. Official reports listed it simply as M1 aircrew armor. But whatever name it bore, it had changed the very rhythm of survival in the air war. At first, the numbers seemed almost too good to believe. Casualties among aircrews wearing the vest dropped dramatically, not just minor wounds, but fatalities. Where once medics had seen gut wounds, collapsed lungs, and severed arteries, now they saw bruises, burns, and shallow cuts. "They're coming home with the same flak holes," one surgeon said, "but they're coming home alive." The men noticed too. Waist gunners, the most exposed of all, became the vest's fiercest advocates. They stood behind their twin .50 caliber guns, bodies pressed to the open wind, the air freezing at 40 below, and trusted those few pounds of steel more than anything else on the plane. One gunner from the 390th Bomb Group told a reporter, "It's like carrying luck on your chest. You can hear the flak hit and know you'll live to hear it again." But not everyone was celebrating. Back in Washington, the story of Johnson's vest had reached the upper brass, and with it, a wave of resentment. Official channels had been bypassed. A field surgeon had succeeded where research divisions with million-dollar budgets had failed. Committees formed to review the vest's origins, to determine whether proper authorization had been granted, and, though it was never said aloud, to decide who should get the credit. The War Department's Medical Research Council tried to reframe the story. Reports began to surface describing the flak vest as a result of collective development efforts between air units and engineering commands. Johnson's name was buried deep in appendices. To the bureaucrats, it was a matter of order. The military machine couldn't be seen as reliant on individual initiative. But to the men flying over Berlin, none of that mattered. They knew exactly whose idea had saved them. In letters sent home and interviews printed in stars and stripes, airmen mentioned Johnson by name. "Doc J's vests keep us breathing," one crewman wrote. Word spread through bases from Italy to France. British crews began requesting American-style vests, preferring them to their own heavier models. Allied surgeons traded blueprints. By the time the Battle of the Bulge erupted in December 1944, Johnson's creation had crossed oceans and command structures alike. The Battle of the Bulge brought his invention its ultimate trial. The Luftwaffe, desperate and cornered, threw everything it had at Allied bombers. The skies over the Ardennes were a furnace, German fighters slashing through bomber streams, anti-aircraft guns thundering from every ridge. Crews fought and froze and prayed their way through the storm. After one particularly savage raid over Cologne, a B-17 named Old Glory landed with its fuselage torn open. The bombardier stumbled out, covered in soot and blood, clutching a jagged piece of metal in his hand, a twisted shard of flak the size of a knife blade. Embedded in it were scratches of paint and the dented surface of his vest. "This thing," he told the medics, holding it up, "was supposed to be in me." Photographs of the vest, battered, bent, and still intact, circulated among bomber groups like sacred relics. For the airmen, it wasn't just protection. It was proof that someone on the ground understood what they were enduring, someone who had fought for them when regulations wouldn't. Still, for Johnson, the battle was far from over. Recognition from the Air Force was slow, reluctant, and wrapped in red tape. He was invited to present his findings to senior medical officers in London, but the briefing turned into an interrogation. They questioned his methods, his authority, his use of unauthorized materials. At one point, a colonel asked why he had risked his career for a project that wasn't sanctioned. Johnson's reply was calm, almost weary, "Because permission takes longer than dying." That line, simple, defiant, spread through the ranks almost as fast as his vest had. It became a quiet motto among medics and mechanics alike, a reminder that innovation in war often depended on courage, not clearance. By early 1945, the numbers told their own story. Over 400,000 vests had been produced and distributed. Casualty rates among bomber crews had fallen to their lowest point of the war. Missions that had once seen half a squadron lost now returned with nearly all aircraft accounted for. The difference was measured not just in statistics, but in lives, in homecomings, in letters that no longer began with, "We regret to inform you." Yet, as victory neared, the official histories being drafted for the post-war record barely mentioned the man who had started it all. The vest had been rebranded, standardized, and folded neatly into the machinery of progress. Johnson himself remained in Europe, exhausted, running on coffee and adrenaline, watching the bombers come home from their final missions. He never forgot the first time he saw one land without casualties. The crew stepped down laughing, their vests blackened and dented, their jackets singed. Johnson stood by the ambulance bay, the cold wind whipping through his coat, and for the first time in 2 years, he didn't have to triage a dying man. He looked at those smiling faces and thought, this is what defiance looks like when it works. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the skies over Europe were littered with ghosts. Thousands of bombers had been lost, tens of thousands of men killed or wounded. But for those who had survived, there was an unspoken acknowledgement of something extraordinary. They had lived through the deadliest air campaign in history, and many of them owed their lives to a vest born from defiance. Dr. Dwight Johnson didn't attend victory parades. While crowds cheered in London and Paris, he was still at his field hospital, writing reports. The war had ended, but his battle with the military bureaucracy had not. Headquarters wanted detailed documentation of his protective garment project. Washington wanted manufacturing data for peacetime evaluation. Even as men packed up to go home, Johnson was asked to fill out paperwork justifying something that had already justified itself. What frustrated him most wasn't the scrutiny, it was the silence. The vest had saved lives on a scale that could be measured in thousands, yet official channels rarely mentioned his name. In early post-war summaries, credit was given to U.S. Army Air Force's Medical Division, European Theater. The phrase appeared clinical, anonymous, bloodless. It erased the months of nights spent hammering metal in freezing hangars, the risks, the disobedience. Johnson read the reports and said nothing. He didn't want fame, but he did want truth. Meanwhile, the vests themselves began their next chapter. Thousands of air crewmen refused to give them up. Many brought them home as souvenirs, stuffing them into duffel bags alongside flight jackets and medals. Others repurposed them for new duties. Test pilots wore them during dangerous post-war flights. Engineers studying aircraft ejections used them as prototypes for protective suits. When the Korean War erupted 5 years later, the lessons Johnson had learned in England resurfaced. In Korea, the skies filled once again with flak and jet fighters, and the old problem returned: fragile human bodies inside fast, fragile machines. This time, however, the solution was already waiting. Engineers at the newly formed U.S. Air Force adapted Johnson's wartime design, replacing steel plates with aluminum and fiberglass. They called it the M12 vest. It weighed half as much and could stop high-velocity fragments even more effectively. Though Johnson's name never appeared in the technical manuals, the DNA of his idea ran through every fiber of the new armor. He followed the news from afar, back in the States, where he had been reassigned to a stateside medical research post. By then, he was something of an anomaly in the military system, a man celebrated in whispers but avoided in meetings. His colleagues admired him, but his superiors regarded him with unease. The army didn't like mavericks, especially those who had been right without permission. Still, the data was undeniable. Reports from Korea showed a 74% reduction in fatal torso injuries among aircrews using the improved flak vest. The principles Johnson had proven under fire were now saving lives across another generation of pilots. Quietly, he felt vindicated. But vindication didn't translate to recognition. When the Air Force issued its official post-war report on medical innovations of World War II, Johnson's name was relegated to a footnote. His vest was described as an early field adaptation of existing concepts. That phrase infuriated the men who had known him in England, the mechanics who'd helped hammer the first steel plates, the medics who'd patched up survivors. To them, Johnson's vest wasn't an adaptation, it was rebellion turned into salvation. He received letters for years afterward, from veterans, from families, from men who credited his invention with their lives. Some enclosed photos of the dented vests they had kept as reminders. One note, written in shaky handwriting from a former waist gunner, read simply, "Doc, I've had 20 more birthdays because of you." Johnson kept that one in his desk. By the 1950s, the U.S. military had fully standardized body armor for airmen and ground troops alike. The technology advanced rapidly: lighter materials, Kevlar fibers, composite ceramics, but the foundation remained the same: the understanding that protection had to be built for the men inside the machine, not just the machine itself. In research papers, engineers called it crew survivability. Johnson just called it common sense. Outside the Air Force, civilian medicine also began to feel his influence. Surgeons studying trauma in car accidents noticed patterns similar to flak wounds, blunt impacts, fragment injuries, internal bleeding. Johnson's wartime research on protective gear quietly informed some of the earliest experiments in vehicle safety restraints and later, ballistic vests for police officers. It was the strange afterlife of a battlefield invention, born from blood, repurposed for safety. But for Johnson, none of it erased the bitterness that lingered. In 1956, when the Air Force Museum opened an exhibit on aircrew life in World War II, his vest was displayed behind glass, without his name. The placard read, U.S. Army Air Forces Flak Vest, 1944. When a young curator later discovered his role and suggested updating the display, the answer from headquarters was polite but firm: the records do not support individual attribution. Johnson never complained publicly. In private, he laughed it off, saying, "They can have the credit, as long as the boys keep their chests intact." But his friends knew it hurt. Recognition wasn't about ego, it was about truth, about the principle that saving lives shouldn't require breaking rules. He retired quietly in the early 1960s, his name largely unknown outside military medical circles. When asked in an interview what he was proudest of, he paused for a long moment, then said, "The first day no one came back bleeding. That was enough." The interviewer pressed him, didn't he ever feel frustrated that history had forgotten him? Johnson smiled faintly and replied, "History forgets a lot of people. But the ones who lived because of them don't." By the time the jet age dawned, the skies had changed, but the lesson Dr. Dwight Johnson had written in steel remained the same: technology could make war faster, deadlier, more efficient, but without protection for the men inside the machines, it was just a faster way to die. In 1965, 2 decades after Johnson's quiet rebellion, a squadron of American pilots in Vietnam prepared for another kind of war. They flew through clouds of anti-aircraft fire, just as the bomber crews had over Europe, and when they returned to base, many carried with them a new generation of flak vests, lighter, layered with woven nylon, but unmistakably descended from Johnson's design. The young medics and engineers who distributed them had never heard his name. Yet every stitch, every plate, every reinforced seam carried his imprint. His ghost lingered in the rhythm of safety briefings, in the calm efficiency of crews checking their gear before takeoff. For Johnson, now long retired, the echoes of his wartime invention followed him in unexpected ways. Letters still arrived, some from veterans, others from military doctors who had come across his field reports in archives. A few even sought him out in person. One young Air Force surgeon visited him in the early 70s and brought a vest used by pilots flying F-105 Thunderchiefs. He set it on Johnson's kitchen table and said, "Sir, this is yours in spirit." Johnson smiled, running his hands over the fabric. "No," he said softly. "It's theirs." By then, the world had moved on. Spaceflight dominated headlines, computers were reshaping engineering, and the men who had built the wartime medical miracles of the 1940s had faded into obscurity. Yet the seed Johnson had planted, the belief that battlefield medicine could not wait for permission, had taken root. Across every branch of the military, medical officers and field engineers began to operate with a new mindset: solve the problem first, argue about the paperwork later. It was a quiet revolution, born from one man's defiance and nurtured by necessity. In 1973, the Pentagon commissioned a retrospective study on life-saving innovations of World War II. Buried in the appendix was a section on aircrew protection. It traced the evolution of the flak vest from the original, field modification by U.S. personnel in England, to modern composite body armor. The report didn't mention Johnson by name, but the chain of lineage was unmistakable. Every improvement, from the aluminum inserts of Korea to the Kevlar fibers of Vietnam, traced back to his prototype. A colleague mailed him a copy of the study with a note that read, "You're still in the footnotes, Doc, but the right kind of footnotes." That same year, Johnson visited an air museum near Dayton, Ohio. In one exhibit, a mannequin wore an M1 flak vest beneath a bomber jacket. The label described it as "Standard Issue Protective Armor for Aircrew, 1944." He stood before it for a long time, remembering the nights spent welding in a freezing hangar, the smell of oil and blood, the sound of engines roaring overhead. A group of schoolchildren passed behind him, pointing at the bombers, laughing. None of them would ever know the man who had made survival possible for the men who flew them. Johnson didn't mind. He had never done it for that. He died quietly in 1980, at the age of 68. There was no grand obituary, no headline in the papers, just a brief mention in a local medical journal that Dr. Dwight Johnson, noted Army Air Forces surgeon, contributed significantly to wartime medical safety advancements. But for those who remembered him, the medics who had served under him, the airmen who had walked out of burning bombers because of him, his legacy was far greater than words on a page. Years later, a historian compiling oral histories from World War II airmen came across Johnson's name again and again. Veterans who could no longer remember the names of their own crewmen still recalled the doctor who made their vests. One of them, a retired pilot, summed it up best: "We had gods in the sky, and we had gods on the ground." Johnson was one of the latter. By the 1990s, modern body armor, Kevlar, ceramic plates, tactical vests, had become standard for soldiers and airmen alike. The principle Johnson had fought for, that human protection was as vital as offensive capability, was now military doctrine. Every vest, every armored flight suit, every piece of personal protection issued by the U.S. military carried an invisible signature, a lineage of compassion welded into function. In museums and archives, his name began to resurface. Curators re-examined wartime medical records, and his contributions slowly gained recognition. Decades after his death, a small display at the U.S. Air Force Museum finally gave him credit: Dr. Dwight E. Johnson, pioneer of the first effective flak vest for American aircrews, 1943 to 1944. The caption was small, almost understated, but to those who knew the story, it carried the weight of justice long overdue. The vests themselves, preserved in collections, still bear the marks of war: jagged holes, burned scars, shrapnel dents frozen in steel. They are silent testaments to a time when courage meant more than following orders. Each one tells a story not only of the man who wore it but of the man who dared to make it. In the end, Johnson's defiance became his greatest gift. His unauthorized invention broke rules, challenged authority, and changed the very fabric of military medicine. It proved that compassion could be an act of rebellion, and that sometimes, saving lives requires ignoring the paperwork. And though history often forgets the quiet heroes, the sky does not. Every pilot who straps on armor before climbing into a cockpit, every soldier who fastens a vest before stepping into danger, carries a fragment of Johnson's legacy, the echo of a surgeon who refused to wait for permission to save a life.